Presentations left. Let's give Simon the respect that he deserves and return to our seats. All right, that means everybody in the back. He's going to live stream this, man. Respect the game. All right, let's come together. Let's give our final two presentations the respect that they deserve. Before we do this, one of the things, again, Dr. Jeff is helping me. Obviously, this health journey. I went ahead. You see me wear these hats occasionally. It says, what, Michael, help me again? Yeah? So I actually had 10 made because I was the smallest sample order, and I've actually autographed them. So I have 9 to just throw out to the audience. If you want them, let me know you want them. I go out over here.
I asked you about your hat.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? Send me a DM and I'll get you one. All right, so with that said, that funny game's done. The Uneducated Economist.
No worries. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for the wonderful applause. It's so fabulous to be here. You know, these economic conferences, they're really all about networking, and that's really what Mike Zuber has really pushed inside of this. This is one thing that I really get a big kick out of this particular event, all the other ones that I've ever been to. And that is, this one is a really tight community. And I mean, I'm like serious about it. I'm not trying to yank your chain or anything. This is a tight community. You guys are really big into networking. You're really into sharing your ideas and really helping each other move up in that property ladder ownership, or even starting that YouTube channel. And that's really where I think Mike has introduced me to his audience here, is because of the things that I've done on YouTube. Now, for those of you who've known me, like, throughout my career here on YouTube, if it's actually a career, you know that I started off really slow. Like, I didn't have much going on in the early days. In fact, when I started my YouTube channel, I didn't think anything was ever gonna come from it, right? You know, I mean, I'm sitting here babbling on about economics. I've been studying it for a while. Nobody was really listening to me. And I had a coworker who had come to me one day and she says, listen, dude, she puts her fist on my desk, you know, and she says, you need to start a YouTube channel or a blog or something, because, you know, nobody here understands what you're talking about and you're driving us crazy. And I thought, oh, yeah, okay, Brittany, I hear you. I'll do that. So I took my iPhone 6, which was used. I bought it for $100. I went down to my car, I hit record, and I did an introductory video to the Uneducated Economist. I didn't know anything about what I was doing. I just fired it up, says, hey, you know, I'm gonna make this YouTube channel. I'm gonna try and share some of the things that I find with my friends and family. I hope it helps them out. I went back into work, uploaded that video through the Works Wi-Fi, and the Uneducated Economist was born, all right? I had no clue what it was that I was gonna do with this channel. I didn't even know if I was gonna be posting another video after that, but I did. I had my family encourage me, I had a few friends who encouraged me, and nobody watched, right? 12 videos, 20 videos, 30 videos later, and I just started to catch a little traction, you know? I was incorporating what it was that I knew about the lumber industry from my retail position at the lumber yard, incorporating my macro understanding of economics. And putting these two together, I started catching attention. People really loved that position that I was holding. Being at the lumber yard, looking at macroeconomics, looking at the lumber industry, sharing my thoughts about what that means for the building industry, and my channel really started to catch some traction. And so really, it was the lumber industry for me that really kind of carried the channel. So when lumber took off and it ran up to 1,700 per thousand, all of a sudden, all these people are just coming to my channel. They're like, dude, what the hell's going on with lumber? And I'm like, it's crazy, right? But yeah, there's a supply chain breakdown that's happening right now, and mill curtailments and inventory shutdowns and all kinds of stuff that's happening. And they're like, yeah, it's the Fed money printing, right? I'm like, no, it's supply chain, guys. I just said it, right? You know, I've been, you know, I got 100 videos that I've been doing talking about lumber all before all this took off. You can see where there's mill curtailments, inventory shutdown. Don't worry, it's going to go back to normal. And they're like, man, you don't know anything about the Fed. And I'm like, okay. When you guys are looking at this at 1,700 per thousand, and I'm telling you it's going to go back down to normal, what are you going to say then? And I went way out on a limb, and I went, oh no. I hope lumber goes down. But I kept looking at all my stuff, you know, and I'm looking at everything that I'm researching, and I'm like, nah, I'm right. I got this. This. I know what I'm looking at. I understand it. I'm in the right position. Nobody's seeing what I'm seeing. Lumber's going to go back down to normal. And then it happened, right? And so all these people were now wondering, what is it that was taking place? Like, why is it that lumber ran all the way up to 1,700 per thousand and now it's back down at 500 per thousand, which is a price that we were experiencing back in 2017, before all the inflation. So I knew then, it was just like, there's something going on within the monetary policy, within the narrative that is being spoken, that is being delivered out there to the people, that is a manipulation. I knew it. I could see it within the news articles. I could see all these lumber articles out there, and I'm like, they're all wrong. Every one of these people are not saying the right things. So that's when I really started diving into monetary policy. And I said, well, if I can convince them about my understanding of lumber, and it was my understanding of macroeconomics that gave me the understanding of lumber, I got to be able to communicate the macroeconomics better. And I really started diving into monetary policy, directly from the Federal Reserve. Not the political version that everybody looks at, but directly from the FOMC. That's the Federal Open Market Committee. These are the people, the 12 voting members on monetary policy. To think like the entire world is really at the, not necessarily control, but at the decision making of 12 people. Like a lot of people look at Jerome Powell and they say, hey man, he's the reason. He's a spokesperson. I hope people realize that. Like, he's just a messenger. He's the chairman of the FOMC, but he is delivering the message for the FOMC. There's 11 other voting members on that. So I said, okay, who are these 11 other voting members? So I started researching into the speeches that they give. And now I don't know how many people are willing to go and read a Federal Reserve speech.
Not many.
They are about as dull as you could ever possibly imagine, right? And then also, they speak in a really funny language. Like, you can understand the words that they use, right? I mean, you know, we understand the definitions of it, but they communicate in such a way that it's so confusing that I was just like, man, I don't understand anything that these people are talking about. They do that on purpose. There's a reason for that. Their monetary policy that is being conducted right now is literally credible threats. And this is what I have come to the understanding in trying to deliver a message, is that I've come up with this credible threat theory. Now, the credible threat theory is really decades old. In fact, it's probably better than 20 years old, considering that I go back to a Ben Bernanke speech that was given in 2002. Now, that's the start of it. And I think to myself, if he could give this speech in 2002, then you know that they were thinking about it long ahead of time. So in 2002, Ben Bernanke gave a speech talking about deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here. And now in this speech, excuse me, let me get my tablet up here again. Oh, gotta look at my face, there we go. Now, in this speech, it's called Deflation and How to Prevent It from Ever Occurring Here. He talks about a major issue that the Federal Reserve was going to be running into. And that is that the Fed funds rate was gonna hit the lower bound of zero. Now, I'm sure everybody has heard the Fed funds rate, right? Yeah, Fed funds rate, you know, somebody. Not a lot of people really understand the Fed funds rate. They just know that it's an interest rate that the Federal Reserve is trying to manipulate. It's a short-term interest rate at the banking level, right? So the overnight lending rate that these big banks with each other, that's the effective fund rate. That's what the Federal Reserve is trying to target. Now, prior to 2019, it was kind of easy to understand how the Federal Reserve would manipulate this rate. The overnight lending rate between the big banks was being conducted in what they refer to as a limited reserve system. This limited reserve system meant that at the end of the day, some of these big banks had excess reserves and some of them were in need of reserves. The ones who had excess reserves would lend them to the ones who were in need of reserves. That overnight lending rate was the effective fund rate. So when the Fed put an interest rate, setting number 5%, 2%, whatever it was at the time, it was as if they wrote it on the wall. Said, this is what we're shooting for, boys, okay? That overnight lending rate, that was the effective fund rate. So now in order to make the effective fund rate their target, they had to buy and sell those reserves off of the big banks. So they would buy and sell treasuries, right, off these big banks, adjusting the reserve requirement or reserve levels. That reserve requirement on the overnight lending would then establish the effective fund rate. Does kind of make sense? Okay. September of 2019, everything changed. Do everybody remember what happened in September of 2019? Overnight lending rate shot up to 10%, and the banks weren't going to open up the next day. You guys remember they started up the repo facility, started that non-QE QE? You guys remember this story where they were going to be buying treasuries and then flipping them every single day in order to provide the liquidity for the banking system? So that repo facility ended up becoming a standing repo facility. And that effective fund rate that they would establish at the big banks level on that overnight lending had moved over to the repo facility and something else called interest on excess reserves. Now, the important part was the repo facility, because now the Federal Reserve had control of interest rates, not at the banking level on the overnight lending, but over here at the repo facility. COVID kicks in, quantitative easing, massive purchases of assets, mainly treasuries. The big banks are the primary dealers. They're loaded up on this stuff. They remove the reserve requirements, and now that excess reserves are now landing at the repo facility in something called interest on excess reserves. And it's between these two accounts that are held at the Federal Reserve that the big banks were putting their money into is how the Federal Reserve was able to channel the Fed funds rate. Does that kind of make sense? So it moved from the overnight lending rate over to the repo facility and the interest on excess reserves. At some point, the liquidity is going to fall down and the repo facility will no longer be needed. It'll eventually come to what I'm assuming is going to be a limited reserve system again, and then they'll fire up the discount window in order to provide liquidity back to the banking system. This is something that the Federal Reserve has been discussing quite a bit. Now, the reason why I bring all that up is because we have to understand the Fed funds rate. This is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve is absolutely used for their monetary policy tool. Everybody knows this. When they adjust rates, that is their policy, right? So if they want to stimulate the economy, they'll lower rates. They want to restrict the economy, they'll raise rates. However, Ben Bernanke was describing something back in 2002 where this was going to come to an end. And that, let me fire it back up here again, guys. So now Ben Bernanke had described back in 2002 a situation that was going to come. And this is exactly what he had to say. It says, a deflation recession may differ in one respect from a normal recession, in which inflation rate is at least modestly positive. Deflation of a sufficient magnitude may result in a nominal interest rate declining to zero or very close to zero. Once the nominal interest rate is at zero, no further downward adjustments in rates can occur, since lenders generally will not accept a negative nominal interest rate when it's possible to instead hold cash. At this point, the nominal interest rate is said to have hit the zero bound. So now this is important to understand, right? Because once the Fed funds rate hits zero, they're done. That's it. There's no more adjustment in monetary policy. So how is it that the Federal Reserve is going to stimulate the economy? How do they create the inflationary scenario when you have a recessionary pressure that's creating a deflationary scenario? How do they stimulate the economy if they hit the lower bound of zero? They're done. They're cooked. Ben says, no, we got a lot of tools. Let me describe this tool to you, he says. Later in the speech, he goes on to say this. Let me get it down here. All right. It says here, the conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from a basic economic reasoning. And this is Ben Bernanke saying this. A little parable may prove useful. Today, an ounce of gold sells for $300 more or less. Now you gotta think this is 2002, right? So a long time ago. Sells for $300 more or less. Now suppose that the modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of new gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified, and he announces his intention to begin the massive production of gold within days. What would happen to the price of gold? Presumably, the potentially unlimited supply of cheap gold would cause the market price of gold to plummet. Indeed, if the market for gold is any degree efficient, the price of gold would collapse immediately after the announcement of the invention, even before the alchemists had produced and marketed a single ounce of the yellow metal. Do you hear how the credible threat would be enough to adjust the prices of gold? This is their monetary policy, the words that they are using. There's a great example of this. Now, I'm going to jump to this speech that was given by Richard Clarida. Where's it right here? And this speech was given May 21st of 2020. Very interesting, something that he had brought up inside of this speech that really relates to this credible threat. Now, we have to think, at the time that he was given this speech, COVID was just kicking in and really running rampant, and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and everybody was getting together to put the stimulus packages together in order to support the economy. He talks about that particular situation. This is not normal for the Federal Reserve or the Treasury to go through, right? But we weren't really necessarily in normal circumstances. But this is what he has to say. Right? Talking about these programs. March 17th, the Federal Reserve Board announced the establishment of no fewer than nine new facilities to support the flow of credit to households and businesses. These programs are authorized under emergency lending powers granted to the Fed under 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act and are available only in, quote, unusual and exigent circumstances, and with the consent of the Secretary of Treasury. He goes on to describe that they funded these things and got them all ready. This is the important part right here. It says this: with these facilities, we are providing a bridge by stepping in and supporting lending throughout the economy until the recovery takes hold. These programs are designed to offer a backstop source of funding to the private sector, and just the announcement of these backstop facilities, which soon be launched, appears to have bolstered confidence in the capital markets, allowing many companies to finance themselves privately before the facilities were up and running. Do you hear that? These guys said, hey, we're going to set up a special purpose vehicle which is only available in unusual and exigent circumstances. We are going to fund it with hundreds of billions of dollars, and then they went out there and blasted all over the mainstream media. The Federal Reserve is buying corporate debt. They're going to be picking the winners and losers, right? Of course, they came out and said, hey, we're saving the fallen angels, right? But I was one of the YouTubers out there who was screaming this. They're picking the winners and losers. They are going to decide who, what corporations, or whatever succeeds and fails. That's not what happened. See, the credible threat that was actually being channeled through me saying that out there had the markets convinced that the Federal Reserve was going to be stepping in and buying these corporate debt through the special purpose vehicle. And then the markets tried to front run the Federal Reserve by loading up on corporate debt far ahead of the Federal Reserve. Just these announcements of these special purpose vehicles was essentially the same thing as the gold machine for these corporations. They didn't have to bail them out. They bailed out themselves through the market itself with the establishment of these special purpose vehicles and the credible threat that went with it. So as you start to look through the economy at different areas, you're going to start seeing credible threats in many ways. It's not the only one. There's many ways of looking at credible threats. Even just recently with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, right? How many people were really lit up about the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Well, when you go and you look at the executive order, it's a blueprint to create one. Not to create one, to create the blueprint. It's like saying, hey, I want to create a house. Okay. Here's an executive order to create the blueprint for the house, right? That's what the executive order did. It created the idea or allowed for the idea to manifest into something that could be transferred into a sovereign wealth fund. Same thing with tariffs. How many people have heard promising of tariffs coming into the future? I mean, people ask me all the time, what does it mean for a 25% tariff on lumber? And I'm like, what tariff? Like the one that they're promising, the credible threat of a tariff, or the actual tariff that took place 6 months ago of 17% that nobody seemed to care about, right? I mean, there was a huge lumber tariff 6 months ago. Does anybody know about that? Like, hardly. I mean, people who follow the lumber industry might have recognized it or seen it or maybe remember something on the news from it, but it wasn't being pushed out there. 25% tariff is going to cause all this lumber. Oh, no. And I'm listening to this noise and I'm like, why is this being done? Like, why are they saying it? And then I realized, it's the credible threat. They're establishing this credible threat, making sure that people feel that it's going to happen. And then what ends up taking place, they take action, right? They start investing in ways as if those tariffs have already occurred. Now, they very well could occur, and I'm not saying that they're not. All I'm saying is they haven't yet, but yet you have people taking action right now doing it. You see how this works? Yeah, okay. So now, more that you dive into it, the more you look at it, the more you're going to find reasonings that they're doing it this way. And the number one reason that they're doing it is because the monetary policy of adjusting interest rates doesn't work. It works if they talk about it, but the actual adjustment of interest rates does not have the same impact on the economy like it once had. I mean, you think about this for just a minute. They had interest rates at 0 after the great financial crisis. They took their balance sheet, the Federal Reserve took a balance sheet of $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion. Like, you know, you talk about money printing, they quadrupled the money supply back then. This last go around was a doubling of the money supply. Don't get me wrong, a lot of money. But in a percentage basis, didn't even come close to what they did during the great financial crisis. But yet, all that money printing, all that expectation, all those ideas of hyperinflation going to destroy the world, and again, I was one of those people, dove completely headfirst into silver, right? 100% in silver, watched it go all the way up to $50 an ounce, came all the way back down, right? Hyperinflation didn't take place. In fact, the Federal Reserve was looking for inflation. They couldn't find it, and it was screwing them up big time. I take you to this speech that was given by John Williams. This is one of my favorite speeches. He lays it out before COVID, before the inflationary scenario. He straight up says it. This speech, Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, I probably read 1,000 times. I have talked about it on my channel so many times, I can't even count. I'm gonna make John Williams wish he never wrote this speech, right? I am not gonna let him forget that he had this to say inside of this speech. Today, we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term interest rate, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Here we go. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Can you believe that? 2018, November of 2018, prior to COVID, prior to all the inflationary scenario we're seeing, John Williams is basically saying that if they don't solve their problem of a persistently too low of inflation, which means that they would rather have a persistently high inflation, their monetary policy isn't going to work anymore. Goes on to say this. What does a low neutral interest rate mean for monetary policy and anchoring inflation expectations? When a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates, and this shortfall of monetary accommodations would result in a less desirable economic outcomes during the recession and recovery. In particular, inflation would typically undershoot the desired target during these episodes. The persistence of below target inflation rates in many advanced economies over the past decades is a testament to this dynamic. Now, I know they talk very confusing like, and again, I've read this speech 1,000 times, but ultimately what he is saying there is that there is a neutral rate of interest. That is when the Federal Reserve is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. They're neutral. That neutral rate was almost at 0. Dropping interest rates well below the neutral rate to stimulate the economy couldn't happen. It was over, right? This is such a big deal that nobody seems to understand or actually look at. I can't find any other articles, I cannot find anybody else talking about this situation, so I'm assuming they're hiding it on purpose. We go on to many speeches here, guys, and I don't think I'm gonna have time to go through all of them, but I really wanna hit on a couple of these things because they had an answer for this problem. It's called the makeup strategy. What they're going to do is let inflation run extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time. They wanted that inflation rate to be elevated. If the inflation rate is elevated, what it will do is start dragging the neutral interest rate higher. If they can drag the neutral interest rate higher, they are actually gaining their ammo back. See, if they dropped interest rates to zero, they wouldn't be far enough below neutral to stimulate the economy. But if they can persist into the economy for a while and have an elevated inflation, then they'll raise the neutral interest rate. Raising this neutral interest rate is the gaining of their ammo, because now they're going to be able to drop below the neutral interest rate enough to actually stimulate the economy again. Big problem. Nobody knows where neutral is. You can't see it, right? You can look in the past and see it, but nobody knows where it is today. There's all kinds of estimates out there, but again, nobody knows exactly where it is. Michelle Bowman, right, another member of the FOMC, incredibly influential there, had something pretty interesting to say. Let me see, this is the wrong one. Had something pretty interesting to say in a speech given January 9th of 2025. So it's, a little old, but not terribly old, right? And she says this: the target range now reflects 100 basis points of cuts since September, and the policy rate is now closer, in my estimates, to the neutral level, which is higher than before the pandemic. Now, it's kind of interesting to think, well, it's closer, much higher, that neutral interest rate is rising. Well, if I think about it, if the neutral interest rate is rising and the Federal Reserve is standing still, then the restriction on the economy becomes a whole lot less, doesn't it? People wonder why we have such a resilient economy. Well, with an elevated inflation expectation that raises the neutral interest rate, it makes the economy less restricted if the Federal Reserve is standing still. Does that make sense? Right? Not really, but if you think about this, in the neutral interest rate and what it is that the Federal Reserve is looking to do with their Fed funds rate, regaining their ammo means raising the neutral interest rate. If an elevated inflation expectation raises the neutral interest rate and that neutral interest rate rises, the economy becomes less restricted. Next thing you know, you have an economy that seems to be incredibly resilient. And the Federal Reserve is also regaining their ammo, meaning that if they do drop interest rates, they may actually be able to drop them well below the Fed or the neutral rate in order to stimulate the economy. Something interesting that she also had to say is this that relates very much to that. It says this: as I continue, as she says here, I also continue to be concerned that the current stance of policy may not be restrictive as many see it, right? Because given the emerging strength of the economy, it seems unlikely that the overall level of interest rates and borrowing costs have proved meaningfully restrained. Meaningfully restrained. Basically, what she is saying is that these elevated interest rates don't seem to be restraining the economy as much as that they had predicted it would. We have inflation that is running persistently high. We have an elevated neutral interest rate that is regaining the Fed's ammo. It sounds to me like it's John Williams' dream to have this scenario taking place right now so that they can get their Fed funds rate back. Now, something that was also said inside of John Williams' speech is something that they wanted to do with inflation. Right? And that is this. There we go. He said, an option to do this, average inflation targeting. Now, how many people have heard about the 2% target? Right? The Federal Reserve shooting for 2%, right? 2%, 2%. This is what they're going. If they can't achieve 2%, they're doing their best to get to 2%. It's so funny. The 2% was just an arbitrary thing that was made up one day. You know that, right? Like, this is where it came from. It came from a news. They didn't, like, there is no math. Like, they just, like, one day they're like, oh, I don't know, let's do 2%. Right? Really, it came from a New Zealand central banker out there who kind of thought that 2% was about the right level, for the inflation rate, and that it would be, consistent for supporting the economy and keeping labor and not, everybody all losing their mind and stuff. So this 2% average, or this 2% inflation rate was really just kind of like a guess. Like some of them were saying between 1 and 3, whatever. Right? So this 2% was just kind of a made up thing. But everybody seems to be hyper-focused on it. Like the Fed is trying to get to 2%, right? Well, I never really believed it. I never thought that the Fed was trying to get to 2%. And the reason why I never thought that they were getting 2% is because John Williams said that they can't really go for that. They need to go for something that's going to be a little different because they need to make up for the fact that they weren't able to get to 2%, like the great financial crisis, quantitative easing, low interest rates, zero interest rate policy for all these years and no inflation. He was just like, okay, we need to figure out something else. And this is something that he had to say. He said, an option is average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an inflation above target in good times when the lower bound is not constrained. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times, so that the long-run average inflation is in line with the expectations in the target. It's very interesting how they word these things. But they were going to let inflation run extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time to make up for the fact that they failed to achieve the 2% target. This is a make-up strategy. Just a few years later, there's a document that comes out called the make-up strategy. Right? Now, I'm not kidding, that's what it says. It's how literally, it came out. It's called How a Robust Make-up Strategy to the Key Alternative Assumptions. All right, now in this working paper, they had something really interesting to say. Oh, no, that's not the one I wanted to read, I'm sorry. Here we go. Make-up strategies work best when the public understands, believes, reacts to policymakers' commitment to offset misses in inflation from the 2% objective in the future. In particular, terrible reader, guys. All right. In particular, make-up strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectations. You see this? When, like, again, the gold machine. You think about the gold machine, and they're saying it right up, straight up, right? Policymakers is best most powerful when they can influence the public's inflation expectations. In doing so, policymakers face a dynamic tension. They must maintain long-run inflation expectations at 2%, the 2% objective, at the same time moving short-run inflation expectations in response with the new strategy. So here they want to create an elevated inflation expectation, but anchor long-term inflation expectations at the 2%. Wow. All right, talk about complicated. You guys bored yet? All right, good deal. All right, so how are they planning on doing this? Well, we already know from John Williams they have this average inflation thing that they're going to let inflation run extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time to make up for it. Well, what's interesting about that is that the FOMC has a statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. It took me literally hundreds, if not thousands, of documents pouring through to find these, all right, guys? So this is like, I narrowed it down to these. The statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. This is probably one of the coolest things they have ever written that nobody ever saw. It says, in order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Now, how many people still think that they're going for a 2% target? All right, all of a sudden, wait a minute, what's this 2% target all about? Maybe on the long run, right? The 2% over the long run. But right now, are they really shooting for a 2% target? They're shooting for moderately above 2% to make up for the fact that they failed to achieve the 2% target over the previous 10 years. Okay? Now, you could say, well, that was a while ago. They made that statement. Maybe things have changed, circumstances have changed and stuff like that. Well, I don't know if I agree with that, right? Oops. Let me see, is this the one? Michelle Bowman had this to say. Again, very influential from the FOMC. This is a speech that was given April 5th, 2024. It says this: another notable change to the strategy statement was the adoption of some refer to as asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting. Let me read that again. Asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting. This is AFET, right? That's exactly right. All right. Or temporary price level and targeting. Specifically, the new statement noted that in order to anchor long-term inflation expectation at its 2% goal, long-term inflation expectation at 2% goal, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy aims to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. And again, this is what Michelle Bowman just said, just a few months ago, really. I mean, April 25th of 2024, it wasn't that long ago. Right? Now, Powell said the exact same thing back in 2020, but he had something else that was very interesting to put into it. Right? He had the exact same thing for the same reasons, monetary policy, lower bound, all that other stuff, right? This is Powell again, 2020. Right? The persistent undershoot of inflation from its 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Wait a minute. This is before the inflationary scenario. They just they just took the balance sheet to $4.5 trillion. They couldn't find inflation, and yet Powell is saying, it seems counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. And I'm thinking, bro, you couldn't find inflation, man. You just did $4.5 trillion expansion on your balance sheet, and you didn't find inflation. But yet somehow you're just going to magically find it. But this is what he goes on to say. Find it counterintuitive to push up inflation. Okay, after all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy, and we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, shelter, add the burdens many families faced many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs or income. So basically the low-income earners, right? But he says this, however, they know this is the most painful experience of inflation to the group of people is the people at the very bottom of the line, right? The rest of us, it's just okay, so now we don't eat name brand, we eat generic or something like that, right? We can adjust our cost of living, but if you're at the very end of the line and you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're barely making it anyway, the only thing you can really cut is your food, right? So it's painful for the lower end. He knows this. He says, however, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks for the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. So that he knew it. He said it back in 2020, before the inflationary scenario kicked in, that's what they were going to need to do. That they were going to have to push this inflation higher, extra high, extra long for an extended period of time, and it was going to be the most burdensome on those at the lower end. They knew this was coming. He goes on to say this, the persistent undershoot of inflation from the 2% long-run objective is the cause. Oh, I reread that. Where is it at? Sorry, I got to cruise down here to this one. There we go. Okay. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. You see how many times they repeated this? We're talking years, over and over again. They're saying the exact same thing. I keep looking at all these people who are like, 2% target, the Fed's trying to get the 2% target. Let's talk about the 2% target. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? That thing doesn't exist. They say it over and over again here. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Oh, well, ain't that convenient? They have no mathematical formula for figuring this out. So when people say, well, what's the average inflation rate over time? Well, I don't have enough. Who knows? Right? They don't have a mathematical formula for figuring it out. They straight up say it. It's funny, yeah, right? It's not, but it is kind of funny, right? It's not funny. It's funny sad, right? But this is the truth of it. In seeking to achieve, we are not tying ourselves to a mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting. Yeah, right? You know, they can just make it like it's flexible every way, here, there, wherever we want, right? Now, that's the way that I was reading it for a while. It's like, man, they have no way of actually figuring out what average inflation rate is over time. It's essentially arbitrary. There's no real mathematical formula, none of this other stuff. But I couldn't accept that, right? That's not enough for me, because I got to dive deeper into this thing to figure out what it is that they are looking at in order to come up with this average inflation. And it took me a while, but I found it, right? And now this is coming from the Richmond Fed. Oops, sorry guys, I don't have this thing lined up. I'm like the most untech kind of person, you know. Okay, so coming from the Richmond Fed, and I think this was dated when? This was dated October 17th of 2023, so it is a little bit old, but I think the information within it is still going to give us a little bit more clarity on how it is that they're seeing this average inflation. So at the end of this particular document, it has this to say, right? Again, right, repeating myself over and over, but this is how we learn, right? A second significant date is September of 2020, when the FOMC revised its statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. That's what I was reading to you just a little bit ago. In this update, the FOMC adopted flexible average inflation targeting, seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and stated that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Since the revised statement was released, headline PCE inflation has been running at a pace of 5% per year, and core inflation has been running at a pace of 4.4% per year on average. So we got to think this was, October of 2023. But this is the important part, because this is how they're looking at inflation. This is how they're looking at the 2%. It says this: notably, in the update of the FOMC did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess the progress towards its goal. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify a starting date where average inflation through the present day has come in exactly at target. For example, and again, this is an older document, for example, when considering inflation from October of 2008 to August of 2023, headline PCE inflation averaged 2% right on target. Do you see what they're doing? Like, everybody's looking like, where are they going to find that 2% over here? And meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is, okay, how far back do we have to look to find it? You see how everybody's looking opposite of the Fed? Completely different from what the Federal Reserve is doing. Everybody thinks that they're going for this 2% target, trying to get it down to 2%, somewhere in the future is 2%. Meanwhile, they're not going for 2%, but going for moderately above 2%. They're looking backwards for the average inflation and how far back they have to look to find it. Nobody sees it this way. This is all stuff that I'm getting directly from the Fed. These are, literally, guys, I probably poured over 1,000 documents so that I can narrow it down to these 12. Right? It's documents that go back 20 years. How many people have heard information like this? You have? Have you heard about average inflation targeting?
Yes, so I heard Danielle book better. Have you read it?
I haven't read, no.
It's like all this condensed what you're doing.
Is it? Real good. Because I've listened to Danielle before on some of her videos, and it sounded to me like she was talking how they were trying to get it down to a 2% target, but not necessarily keeping that in. Like, to me, I was listening to her, and she said, like, the Fed was trying to get to a particular direction, and when I was hearing that, I'm thinking, no, the Fed is exactly where they want to be. I will. I might do that, because I've been actually asked to do a debate with her, so that would be fun. I wasn't, I don't know if it was really her, if it was just some dude messing with me, but he was just like, I would like to get set up at a debate and I'll be the moderator. I'm like, well, let's do it, man. Anytime, name the place, and then I never heard back. So I don't know, so I don't know if it was real or not. How much time do I got in here? How much time do we have, Mike?
You've got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, perfect. I'm gonna say one more thing because I think this is really important, and if you guys have any questions, I guess we can go into that. But I'm gonna go back to the makeup strategy because there's something that was stated in there that I think is very profound that I think you guys can take home with you, right? Because all this stuff, like, I mean, you know, there's a lot of information I just dumped out. It's gonna be hard to retain all that stuff, right? But there's something that's gonna be said right here that I think you guys can take with you. If you really think about that gold machine and how it is that their words are the ones that are actually conducting the monetary policy and not the actions. Like everybody says, don't listen to what they say, listen to what they do. Completely opposite for the Federal Reserve. Listen to what they say, not so much about what they do. Now, the reason why is this right here. I'm gonna read this out of the monetary, makeup strategy. And it says this: inflation expectations are more difficult to assess because they depend on the public's interpretation of the guidance. Right? Let me read that one more time. It's more difficult to assess because it depends, this is talking about inflation expectation, more difficult to assess because it depends on the public's interpretation of the guidance. So they come out and they say something. How do you feel about that? Right? How are you going to feel about this particular thing that was just said, and what is it you're going to do with that information? An unexpected loosening could lower inflation expectations if the public interpreted this action as the Federal Reserve predicting a weak economy in the future. Let me read it again. An unexpected loosening could be viewed, or could lower inflation expectations if the public interpreted this action as the Federal Reserve predicting a weakening economy. They're cutting interest rates because things are going to hell. Labor market's going crazy. The recession is going to happen. Something bad has taken place. They're cutting interest rates. What does that end up doing? It lowers the inflation expectation. He goes on to talk. If the public instead saw the change simply reflecting a more accommodative policy stance, inflation expectations would rise. We're cutting to be somewhat accommodative. It's not because of anything critical. Labor market's doing awesome. There's no recession coming. It's just a very benign thing that we're doing here. Inflation expectation will rise. The action was the same. They cut. How they delivered that information either was delivered with an inflation expectation that was elevated or one that fell, but the action was the same. Right? It's the PSYOP, exactly right. This is how they are conducting themselves. You think about it, how many people ask, are they gonna cut? How much are they gonna cut? What does that mean for the economy? And I'm like, that doesn't really matter, right? I mean, it matters, right? It's gonna have some kind of effect in the economy. Usually it takes 6 months to a year before it really has any kind of real impact to the economy. But the expectations of the message that was delivered to you will have a profound impact on the inflationary scenario that comes from it. We saw this take place. Think about it, at the last time, it was at the end of 2023, there was the promise of massive interest rates coming, right? Or interest rate cuts coming, right? They were gonna take it to zero, they're gonna match. They don't know how much it's gonna be, but it's gonna be a bunch. 7 interest rate cuts, dot plot map, all this other stuff. All right? 50 basis point cut, followed by 2 25 basis point cuts. One interest rate, one whole point, right? One whole interest rate. Not what people were predicting. They were predicting a hell of a lot more than that. Right? Think about it. At the end of 2023, the expectations of the people in those interest rates cuts and the information that was being delivered to them for the reasons that it was doing, what happened to mortgage rates? Yeah. Right. Well, at first in 2023 they went down, right? They went down all the way up, even to the point that they actually cut rates. Then they went the opposite way. They went exactly opposite of what everybody was thinking. Why? Because of the information that they were delivering, the expectations that they were delivering with it. They had, at the end of 2023, put the expectations into the market that were going to be massive interest rate cuts coming to the economy, and it started lowering rates all on its own. All right? As soon as they said something, the exact opposite happened because they delivered it with a message that had a very concerning point to it. All right, we're done, right? I would love to keep going on. I knew I was going to end up running over. I could continue on for hours, but thank you so much. So let's answer a question here. Yep.
I need to get a mic. That's on me. Don't knock over his computer.
Oh, thank you, sir. Yeah, you could tell.
Benny could tell.
Oh, Benny could tell.
Thank you very much for that. I didn't know how much I'd like geeking out on this until I started trying to translate here, so.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, it doesn't put me to sleep, it keeps me up at night. My question is a little bit different, and it has to do with reserve funds.
Okay.
And so you talked about critical threats. There were a series of bank stress tests after the recent bank failures. It's probably a sensitive subject, so I apologize. It's going to keep anyone else up at night. With the changes to bank-in policies instead of allowing banks to fail, so I'm not talking about FDIC coverage here. My question is about reserve funds. And so as we continue to save, or we have established reserve funds for events large and small, I'm sure many of us rely on those, right, as a backstop in order to protect our investments. How do we assess banks that are in trouble in order to protect our reserve funds from bank-in scenarios? From what I found, it's very difficult, if it's not published, to find banks that failed stress tests.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if there are other mechanisms we could look at to see if the banks we're currently using are in trouble. That's my question.
Interesting. You know, that's an interesting, I don't know if I can specify right down to how to pick it out of an individual bank. You know, it was asked to me, I couldn't tell you how long ago. It was, you know, a few months before Silicon Valley bank failure, right? And I was asked the question, are you worried about having your money in the bank? And my answer was, yeah. And am I going to do something about it? No. Right? And people were like, why? You know, that sounds so crazy. And I'm like, well, it's because the Federal Reserve knows it's coming. They said it. And I don't necessarily trust the idea that the Federal Reserve has like a plan, right? But when they can communicate the issue ahead of time, it leads me to believe that they have some sort of lifeboat or something that would be available to deal with the stress that is beyond that of what it is that we feel that they could handle. Now, when I saw the Silicon Valley Bank thing start to happen and all of a sudden they fired off the Bank Term Funding Program, I'm like, there's that lifeboat. They can't tell you about them. If they told you about them, you would be able to price them into your investment, right? So they don't tell you about these lifeboats, these extraordinary events that would take place that can then allow them to deploy these particular tools. So how it is that you can go and look at a particular bank, I'm not exactly sure about that. But if your concern is about these elevated, you know, risks that these banks have assets that might like fall down below their value and then they're no longer liquid or something of that nature, though I don't like to trust the idea behind it, I've heard the Federal Reserve in some of their statements say, hey, we got plans, contingency plans, and basically backstops to deal with those type of situations that are coming. So, I mean, to me, I don't have a whole lot of fear, but then again, I don't have a whole lot of money inside of it either. So, you know, I mean, that's the way I kind of look at it. All righty, guys, I think we're done here.
We got one more question.
One more question, wonderful, I love it. Yes, sir.
Hey, so I just had a quick question about the fact that we cut 100 basis points between September and the end of the year. This is my first time going through a rate cutting cycle owning property. Is this something that we generally see when we start a rate cutting cycle? Because we're down 100, but the long end of the curve has actually gone up 100 more basis points. So we're looking at 200 basis points more restrictive than the Fed's intention was.
Is this normal? No, right? Because the Federal Reserve, like you got to think, this communication style, like, I mean, I guess if you've been following the Fed for the last 20 years, then, you know, you might be kind of like used to this. But prior to, like, say, the great financial crisis, the Federal Reserve never said anything to you. They, in fact, I could show you inside the documents, but they ultimately were saying at the time, prior to the forward guidance and the using of the credible threat, you know, or the credible threat theory type thing. Prior to that, the central bankers thought that it was more important to hit the markets with a shock than it was to give them the forward guidance. So they thought they would get more power out of shocking the markets. Like you would just wake up one day and all of a sudden the Fed had moved and you're like, holy crap, what's going on here? But then they found that if they deliver a message ahead of time, they could get more power out of it. Then they realized, man, if we have developed all these ways of communicating it through the mainstream media, through the dot plot, through these meetings, through the minutes, through all this other stuff that they didn't use before, now they got all this power behind the interest rate adjustment. So when you say, is it normal? No. This is not normal for the Federal Reserve's operation, but then again, the Federal Reserve lost control of their monetary policy tool and started moving into forward guidance, credible threats. And so again, it's difficult, especially those of us who had learned a lot about the Federal Reserve. Sorry, Mike. I just can't stop, right? It's for those of us who had learned about the Federal Reserve from like the early days and how that is that they use the Fed funds rate, the monetary policy in order to adjust interest rates. This is all new. This is essentially new to them, and the tool that they use is new. So, right?
The
All right.
uneducated economist, folks, is now.
Oh, yeah. Hell yeah, look at that. Yeah, buddy. Thank you, Mike. Man, look at that.
You got a belt and a ring now? You're like legit.
Man, you're so cool. Thank you so much, brother.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much, Simon. Isn't he a lot of fun? Isn't
Look at that, guys.
Speak like interesting.
All right, we call it quits.
And I have an econ degree and went to school for a long time, and we actually researched those.